Hi, everybody. So thanks for joining us today. Hopefully this is a really informative presentation for anyone who has looked at PhoneGap before or looked at Couchbase Lite before and wants to see how to put them together. I'll let Lauren tell you about PhoneGap, although it's hard for me to contain myself because I'm a big PhoneGap fan as well. But I'll start with just a little bit of a background on what is Couchbase Lite. So Couchbase Lite is an embedded NoSQL database for mobile devices. And when we decided to build this, we looked around and saw that there weren't really any other embedded databases that were, sort of up to being called this latest version of NoSQL. There's some older stuff laying around that could be embedded that had some of the NoSQL style data structures, but nothing that was really JSON aware or that was anything remotely like cloud aware. And that's the big thing about mobile. These devices are always moving, and so they need to be aware of the cloud and the fact that the network is available or is not available. So to really build a mobile-first database, we saw there wasn't really anything else out there like that, especially for JSON and NoSQL, and so that's where Couchbase Lite came from. So our strategy around this, we call it JSON Anywhere, and what we mean by that is that we've got JSON on the device so that, as a developer, you're interacting with local data on the device, and you don't have to think in terms of relational data. You can think in terms of JSON data and, have that same natural interaction with the data that you're familiar with from working with REST APIs or all the other places that JSON shows up these days. We also have JSON on the wire, which to us means that our synchronization protocol is based on JSON, and so we could have easily got the same job done with a different synchronization protocol that wasn't powered by JSON, but we would have lost a lot at the same time. So because our synchronization is done using HTTP and JSON, you can put other clients into the mix, and we have some advanced content on the website if you want to learn how you would set up a third-party client to connect to this JSON stream and interact with the data and have your application data replicate on those mobile devices. So JSON on the wire flows from this mobile device to Sync Gateway, which is the sync management access control tier that we've built on top of Couchbase Server. And it's JSON aware also, and it sort of gives you a cloud layer that is aware of your application's data and security model, as well as the JSON documents that are flowing through your application. So the last place that we keep JSON, which is where we've been doing this for a long time, is in Couchbase Server, which is a JSON NoSQL database. I'm sure you can find plenty of information about Couchbase Server online, but for our purposes here, it's your storage engine, and it allows you to scale up your application as new users join. So the big picture is Couchbase Server for storage, Couchbase Lite in your user's hand, and applying the access control and routing data to channels. And we'll talk about the channels and such later on. And then just to kind of take more of a machine view of it, this is that same picture. And you've got Couchbase Server, which people deploy either in S3 or via hosted services like Couchbase, or on their own hardware. And Sync Gateway, which is meant to be accessible over the web. So Couchbase Server is meant to be behind the firewall and only accessed by your application, whereas Sync Gateway is meant to be accessed directly by mobile devices running Couchbase Lite, and also by other API clients. So that should be the big picture of where Couchbase Lite fits in and what it can do. Just in case it's not clear enough from all these pictures, and I'm sure it'll get really clear once Lauren puts put some of the demo on the screen. But what's cool about this for folks who haven't used it before is that if you have a mobile device in your hand and you make a change to some data there, that change is going to flow up through the cloud and out onto the other mobile devices that are interested in it, and will be available on those UIs immediately, or more or less immediately, with just a few seconds of latency. Where what this lets you do as an application developer is just concentrate on that device in the user's hand, and as long as your UI updates to reflect what's happening to the underlying data, then later on, when you enhance your application connected to the cloud, when you add sync, it really is only a few lines of code to configure the application to connect to the cloud, and the data flows between devices more or less transparently to the user, and you've got the same application you had before, but remote changes show up in your user's hand, and it kind of feels like magic. So that's the end goal of all of this, is to have these two devices that are linked via data flowing between them, and have the developer not have to worry about the network in order to make that happen. So with that, I'll wrap up this section, and I'll be back to talk a little bit more about some of the back-end technology later on in the presentation.
Thank you, Chris. And now let me switch the control screen to Lauren, who is going to introduce the PhoneGap solution.
Whoops. All right. Hi, folks. My name is Lauren Beer. I was originally from Vancouver, BC, but I'm now working for Adobe in the San Francisco Bay Area. I started with PhoneGap Cordova at Nitobi, the original creators, and have since continued as a platform lead on the Cordova project. The relationship between PhoneGap and Cordova I'll go over. And I've got contributions to the Cordova Android, iOS, BlackBerry code base, as well as a lot of our tooling. You can find me on GitHub, Twitter, and I have a tech blog where I blog about mobile tech and related matters. So a little bit about PhoneGap. History-wise, PhoneGap was developed by Nitobi as part of a hackathon project where we were trying to address the gap in between devices. It occurred to the first programmers at Nitobi that while these devices had typically different runtimes, different OSs, using different native languages, they all had browsers. And at the time, about 4 or 5 years ago, all of these browsers had, all of these platforms not only had browsers, but had a browser control. Unlike the browser that you open up, Safari on iOS or, say, Chrome on Android, these are view controls that exist as part of the native framework, and you can embed one of these view controls into an application and, for instance, browse the web. What PhoneGap does is it leverages those view controls as a container for a web application and allows your web application to run as a native application and be distributed and monetized through the native stores. So as PhoneGap grew, it became started off as a cross-platform mobile framework across BlackBerry, iOS, and Android, and many other operating systems have come and gone since, but the core is still the same. You write your application in WebTech, and it's run on device as a hybrid app. This allows it to access native device features based on open standards. So it gives you the full sensor suite, geolocation, camera, and other hardware that is attached to the phone. You access this through the JS APIs based on W3C specs generally, and it essentially mimics the execution of a native app, but within this JavaScript container. PhoneGap and Cordova, when Nitobe was acquired by Adobe, we donated the PhoneGap project to the Apache Software Foundation as under the name Cordova. And right now, those two can be used interchangeably. PhoneGap is not differentiated from Cordova. It essentially does the exact same thing, the exact same code base, and we can use those two terms interchangeably. Since its birth as a cross-platform API or a framework, we've drastically changed the architecture of PhoneGap Cordova, and that is most recently been done with the PhoneGap or Cordova CLI. That's our command line interface for managing PhoneGap Cordova projects. Whereas before, you would use our repo or distribution of PhoneGap to create multiple sub-projects, each targeted towards your own, towards an individual platform, and then sync across them your web assets. The Cordova CLI allows you to manage all of that from a single location. So to talk about the CLI, we have to first talk about NPM. NPM is a node package manager, and it has a quick install. It's cross-platform. It's not necessary to know too much about Node or NPM, but once installed, running NPM will get you something like this: npm install-g Cordova. I won't run this because the dependencies will take some time to download, but this will install the Cordova tooling to your system. Right now I'm running on OS X, but the process is very similar on Windows and Linux. And once you have that run, typing in Cordova will provide you with the full API. A quick create command will call this project Noter. And we'll see that we've created a new project. The CLI mostly facilitates our plugin architecture, which was the other big change that came with 3.0. So here we see that we have a stub project. It is a Hello World project written HTML5. Under platforms, we have nothing. So let's add a platform. This has added an iOS platform to our project. And we can see in the platforms directory we now have iOS. We can do the same for any one of the platform keywords like Android. Those are the two that are compatible with Couchbase Lite, so I'll stop there. And we can see that we've got an Android and iOS sub-project within the platform. Next, we'll install some plugins, and this again is done through the CLI. For plugins, what we did in Cordova 3.0 was to design a plugin registry. So all of the plugins that were originally packaged with PhoneGap, all of those APIs, essentially what makes a PhoneGap highly usable and gives you access to the native functionality, have been separated out. So you choose exactly which pieces of functionality you require for your project. This cuts down on the distribution size of a project, which is something very desirable for a mobile project. And if we look in this list, under core APIs, under the org Apache Cordova name, we'll come across the APIs, the plugins that are managed by us, and installing them is as simple as adding a platform. This will install the plugin across both platforms, and if we look at our plugin directory, we see that we've got the org Apache Cordova camera plugin now as part of our project. This will expose the camera API and allow our Cordova PhoneGap project to use or to take pictures. On the Couchbase Lite side, we'll find in the plugin registry a Couchbase Lite plugin as well, and using the same process. This will take a little bit longer because it's slightly larger, but this will install the Cordova or the Cordova Couchbase Lite plugin. You'll see that some of the namespaces are Cordova, some of them are PhoneGap. It's kind of irrelevant which one you use. They'll both end up in the same place and do the same thing. For Cordova tooling, it's a little bit different than PhoneGap tooling. These tools do essentially the same thing. Right now, if you're a little confused and wondering where a good place to start is, the Couchbase Getting Started in 5 Minutes guide uses the PhoneGap tool after installation. And this is doing the exact same thing as the Cordova tool. Which one you use is up to you, but to avoid confusion, you might as well follow this instruction, and this gets you up and running and does essentially what I've done. The final commands that are very useful for the Cordova CLI are the compile, build, and emulate. Unfortunately, due to technical limitations, I can't restart my iOS simulator for the demo I'm about to do, but Cordova emulate iOS will prepare and launch an emulator, an iOS emulator in this case, running our project. And if we were to do Android, it would do much the same thing. A peek inside one of these PhoneGap projects that we've created. I'll just find one. Here we go. A peek inside will, sorry, I've just got to locate a project I've actually created with the tooling. I'm on here we are. So within the plugins directory, we've already seen installation of a variety of plugins. Under the platforms, we'll see the Android and iOS projects that we just created. So this is the core project, and what prepare will do, we'll copy this project to the various platforms. And generally speaking, if you're using going just through the CLI, you don't need to worry about what's in the plugins directory or the platforms directory. But as we'll see, the Cordova platforms iOS folder just has a regular Xcode project, much like you would have seen in the PhoneGap or Cordova 2.0 days. You would have created a project like this specifically for your iOS version of your app. Now both are managed and done for you. And what that will look like running on the simulator is going to be painfully slow on screen sharing, but it's just the Apache Cordova Hello World, which is what we created. It's a boilerplate project that's created in every Cordova create command. What we would do next is pull in resources from somewhere else to actually define our project and separate it from the Cordova boilerplate. And what I'll demo now, and this is why I couldn't restart the simulator using the Cordova CLI, but is the Hailer app I made using PhoneGap and Couchbase Lite. As Couchbase Lite occupies a local data store for the app. So as opposed to using our file API or other resources for keeping track of the app state, as well as user-created data, we're using Couchbase Lite as the backend store. I've kept things light and indecipherable. You can find the code for this app online on my GitHub. I'll go through it after I've demoed it. This is your history, and this is your share. Under the share menu, we see we've got an input field, and we can write anything. Doesn't matter if we return or done. That writes a message. under the camera, if we were on an actual device, we'd be able to take a picture. As such, this button is non-functional. We can go back to the original one. We're back to share. We lose our share. So instead of the camera icon, we'll click on the landscape icon, and this will allow us to go into the device's photo album and choose a picture from our camera roll. A little preview picture down there. We can choose another photo if we want to. And then clicking share will save this to our document store. We look in history, we see that we do indeed have saved documents. We can click on one, and we can see it pulling up that data and what it looks like. We can then go back into one of these, for instance, one of the ones without pictures, add a picture, go back, and that change has now persisted. All right. So looking in Xcode, let's see what's involved in making a little toy app like this. First is the index. I kept things. I was approaching this as like a new developer coming to PhoneGap and Couchbase, and trying to satisfy the needs of a local document store. So I kept things as transparent and lightweight as possible. So there's nothing fancy here. It's a single page application. The divs of class pages are simply swapped out for the different views of the application, like the history view, the share view, and then the main view. This just defines buttons based on SVG, or other buttons based on icons, like we saw. Again, nothing special. So although our magic happens in JavaScript, we start off, all Cordova projects start off with a device ready event, which is caught by our application, and that lets us know that the native APIs have initialized and are ready to be called. Under our album object here, I handle the previewing of images. So for instance, this functionality down here that shows what images have been attached to your message is handled right here, as well as actually getting the images themselves. Now, getting the images is done through a Cordova call, and it's identical for both the camera as well as the camera roll. The only difference is the argument that you provide as the source and destination. So in this case, I want the destination to be a data URI, I should say. So what this function is returning is the raw image data. You can get yourself into trouble doing that in a PhoneGap Cordova project on mobile, simply because there is limited memory on these devices, and adding too many images, trying to deal with too many images simultaneously, can result in memory exceptions. However, we should be pretty safe at this level. So the preview, again, shows the little thumbnail. However, the actual image is full size and full resolution, and is handled in memory right now. Now, the composition object is how we keep track of the current message in the queue. And so right now we're composing a message. We can compose a brand new one. We'll say new message. And then when the share button is pressed, this message is now added to the data store. We'll go down to the share handler. So this is what's executing when we hit our share button, and this is the code that actually interacts with the Couchbase Lite data store. And to get started on that, we're actually going to go down to the initialization code to see where we first get set up. This ugly chain is the on-startup configuration function, and as intimidating as it might look, it just cascades down singly in terms of setup functions until we have the local database information. And this window config site variable is what we're going to store our DB. You see we have a sync URL, and Chris will talk about a little bit about that more later, but primarily this app is interacting with Couchbase Lite as if it were just a local document store. So once this is set up, we're essentially good to go. You'll note that a requirement is to set up views, and we set up views right here. You'll notice 2 views, registration and messages. Each of these just contains a map function, which will allow intelligent queries on the data store. In this case, we're interested in viewing anything of the message doc type as long as it meets proper formatting. Namely, it has text associated with it, and it has user associated with it. And if I look up views past the setup view, once we've registered, right here. So this is the history button, and that's this functionality right here. And if we quickly add another document to the store, share it, we can see that history growing, and we can revisit that same document. The history, or the view kind of API, it provides a very easy mechanism for inspecting and looking, or basically querying your database. So we handle each row inside this particular messaging view, which keeps track of all of the messaging documents that we've created, and then spits it out in an HTML formatted list that we can quickly remove from the DOM or re-add as necessary. And that keeps us in sync, the view in sync with what's going on in our store. We've covered the navigator cam button, which right now is a little underwhelming. Again, it does the exact same thing as the get the photo roll, but when we take a look at it, we see navigator camera get picture is the primary function that we are firing off to PhoneGap, and in the callback we handle the image data that is returned. In this case, we're just updating the view up until the share button is clicked, and that brings us back up here. So now that we've got our view set up and our database set up, there's just a matter of actually contacting it and telling it to store or remove objects. That's, again, all handled through our share button. So first off, the window config site DB, that is the configuration data that we got on setup. The composition ID is a potential ID for this document. It may or may not have one. If it doesn't have one, then it's not part of our database yet, and we will go into the else block, and we are going to post it to the local storage, and that adds a brand new document. If the database, or rather if our document ID does exist, then it currently exists as part of the document store, and we use a different XHR call, put, which updates the document in the database in place. And we've already seen some of those updates happening. It's fairly simple through the XHR API, RESTful API, to manipulate and otherwise query the database. And this provides a really lightweight local storage solution to your app, which provides a lot of functionality and flexibility as your app grows. So for instance, this particular app doesn't do much. It just takes a note, appends a picture, and allows it to be shared. However, that appending of a picture could be an API call to any other part of the PhoneGap API. It could be geolocation data, in which case we may want to overlay on a map. It could be media capture, which means perhaps a sound recording. And because we have a schemaless database store, the app architecture is flexible enough to handle those changes seamlessly. It's just appending a different kind of raw data to the document to send off to the store. Furthermore, and this is something that we were discussing earlier, is it would be very, very difficult to start architecting an app and then worry about cloud syncing later. Typically, something as complex as a cloud-synced database store, cloud-synced storage to your app would be something that you'd have to think about in the very, very early stages of creating your app. And that creates a lot of design overhead that it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the core functionality that you want up and running. For instance, creating these little annotated multimedia messages. Couchbase Lite, the system, as Chris was explaining, very easily lends itself to extensibility in terms of, obviously because it's schemaless, changing design requirements, like what kind of data you're appending to your store, as well as adding that cloud syncing in later as a later design step in your app. And so I think I'll turn it over back to Chris, who will discuss some of the steps in syncing a local Couchbase Lite data store through the sync gateways to the Couchbase Cloud Storage.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Again, I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please type it in the GoToWebinar chat box. Let me switch back to Chris, who is going to wrap up the presentation.
Hey everybody. So let's see. You should see my slides showing up now. So I thought it'd be helpful just to give some links for people who wanted to, get out the code and kind of get into what Lauren was showing there. So if you go to that shortcut at the top of the screen, you can get into the PhoneGap getting started documentation that we have on the site, which will pretty much cover, what he was doing on the command line there. He used the Cordova tools a lot. This will be using the PhoneGap tools, but at the end of the day, it's essentially the same thing. So if you want to take a look at the code that we were just playing with, I think, Lauren, I've got your URL correct there. And then there's also another PhoneGap example application that I built as part of putting together the plugin. I've got a link to that here. And then, we wanted to talk about the cloud. And so, developer, right? You don't want to think of yourself as a cloud user. You want to write mobile apps, and it's cool that you can just add sync after you've put your app together in this kind of lightweight way that Lauren was describing. But then now you've got to manage a whole cloud, and so we know that mobile developers don't want to have to keep an entire fleet of EC2 instances up and running and supporting their applications. So we offer this developer sandbox called Couchbase Cloud, and so you can go to couchbasecloud.com and sign up for a sync gateway in the cloud. And essentially, and I'll talk about this here in just one second, you can use the sync gateway. You put one function in there, one JavaScript function that routes your data and says who's allowed to see what. And the hope is that for 80% of applications, you can get your backend done that way, maybe by extending it with a few other connectors or kind of server-side callbacks. But basically, you can get your security model, your data routing done in Sync Gateway. So by offering this developer sandbox, we're hoping that you can get your app off the ground at least, get your mind around the programming model, give us feedback, and we'll be able to scale with you as you get into those later phases. So
just to jump back in real quick, one thing that I was really impressed with is how fast setting up a sync gateway is. It's a matter of sign up and creation. There's a little bit of a learning curve in terms of the sync function, but the number of different back-end pieces of functionality you can put together with a sync gateway and the sync channels is really astounding. So routing, like for instance in the ToDo app or in the Hailer app, my demo app, routing calls between users, subscribing users to particular message channels. These are all things that can be done very rapidly to create things like message boards, chat services, and other things that would require a lot of overhead to do from scratch. That's
cool, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so just before we jump back over to talk about the cloud fully, I want to Lauren is doing some stuff with binary blobs like photos or audio segments or whatever you've got, and I wanted to show some code just for people who are watching this at home. This will hopefully save some of the memory potential memory issues. So what you can do is take the base64 data that the GetPicture API gives you and store it as an attachment, and then later you can just use an image tag with that URL to that attachment as the SRC, and then avoid loading as much data into your JavaScript runtime. So hopefully with the photo attachment API, you can browse essentially unlimited multimedia collections with Couchbase Lite. So yeah, let's talk about the sync gateway and how the data can flow in there. So you're this app that Lauren showed, right? You've got some photos and some messages stored locally, and maybe you have addressed them to go to some different friends. When you finally get connected to the internet, when the Wi-Fi gods are smiling upon you, and your mobile device has is able to reach sync gateway. So this occasionally connected device, when it's happy, what it does is it sends what it's learned up to the cloud and to the sync gateway via HTTP and JSON. And then the sync gateway has this JavaScript function that's programmable by you, the developer, that routes the data and validates the data to ensure that only valid data is stored. So assuming that the documents are correctly formed, then they can go to Couchbase Server, which is essentially there to be high performance and scalable, and to provide this core kind of event feed back out to sync gateway, so that the sync gateway tier can scale with a shared nothing architecture. So if you get more traffic, you can just throw more machines at this and have more capacity to handle your connected clients. So one of those changes, may have been relevant for one of the other connected users, and some of the other changes you made, some of your other messages that you've saved or to-do lists that you've changed, may be relevant for other people. And there's still other users who don't care, about anything you do. They're looking at an entirely different set of data. And Sync Gateway manages all this for you using a concept called channels. So this is kind of an illustration of channels. You've got documents, and they flow onto one or more channels. So document 1 here belongs to channel A, but the sync function thinks that document 2 can go on both of those channels, channel A and channel B. So now the way that access control works is that users get access to different channels depending, on their basically the permissions associated with their user account. So one of our users now has access to both document 1 and 2, and another. So in an abstract sense, that's kind of how channels operate. In the to-do list example, the way it works is each document, or rather each to-do list has its own channel, and there's all kinds of documents that can flow on that channel. So each task, each item that needs to be checked off is its own document and can be manipulated independently and routed to the people who have access to that to-do list. So you can imagine something like a thread in Lauren's application would define a channel, and there may be multiple users, that are able to see the pictures and the messages that are associated with that thread. So this is it in the abstract, and you can use it to implement a whole lot of different, social or collaborative data flows. And the idea being that by making this part of the programming model simple enough, we can make it, low-hanging fruit to put together custom business applications or, workflows for, specific applications without it being, the case that you have to start out by, picking a server-side framework and building a whole environment, in which to manage your cloud. So let's validate. Let's kind of like go through this data routing. So we've got some documents that are slated for different channels, and they're coming in and they're running through the sync function, and they're being routed to the channels that they belong to. And so I think I've got one more thing I want to show you here, and that's the actual sync function code. So just to give you a sense of when this happens, let's take a look here at stepping through the data coming into the sync gateway. So the data can come in and it hits the sync function after it's been authenticated. So I won't go into the details of that right now, but we know which user it is. So it's come in via the internet from a mobile device over one of these synchronization streams, which could be like a continuous event feed, or it could be the case that the user just reconnected after having been disconnected. And so some updates are flowing in, and they're going to run through your code. And so this is your code, this JavaScript function that you drop into the middle of the sync gateway. And we'll look at that in detail, but it's got some different responsibilities, right? It's got to validate your document, so it can do things like require that only the owner of a document can update it. So by looking at the old version of the document and who was considered the owner, in the previous revision, and make sure that the current user is that document owner. You can also route the data. So, assuming that the data is valid, and it could, be valid for whatever reasons you want to program into it. But assuming it's valid, then it'll go to the channels that you specify using this channel callback. And so that can be, channel names that you come up with, or channel names that are on your document, and you can call it as many times as you want in your code. And then the other neat thing that we realized was missing from the API, that you would have to have done by hand if we didn't include it, is access control. So some of your documents can be special, and when they come through, they can grant access. They can connect a given user to a given channel. So maybe in Lauren's app case, where you have these messages, then a thread may be available to find a channel for that thread and then grant access to the users who were members of that thread using this API. So when that special meta document came through, you'd run some validation on it and make sure that only the right person was doing the update. And then, assuming it validates, you call this access callback, and it changes your, sort of access control configuration for your application there. So then the document continues to go through the rest of the kind of database persistence process, which includes things like making it possible for you to merge and clean up after the fact of maybe two users modified the same document at the same time, and you need to be able to detect that and figure out what to do. And maybe it's more than 2 users. Maybe it's lots of users, and you want to do it at your own pace instead of having to do it right away when you first detect the conflict. So we have a really robust conflict detection and management. And then it goes off and it's stored in Couchbase Server. So, so that's kind of where we are, and here's the actual code. So this is the code that's associated with that to-do list application that we didn't see, but the gist of it is that you can create lists and you can share them with different people. So for instance, I have a grocery list I share with my wife, and I have like a list of fun things to do on the weekend that I share with my friends, and we can check them off as we go. So this is the function that's associated with that. And there are 3 main branches. The first branch is what do we do when we see a task, and so that's just something that could be checked off or not. And all we care about here is that it's got to belong to a list. You can't have a task that doesn't have a list ID. So it's just got to be well formed in that way. And then we put it on the channel that goes with its list. And so that's all. It's just kind of as simple as that for a task. For a list, it's a little more complicated. This is one of those meta documents I was talking about that can actually grant some access. So first we want to validate some things. We want to make sure that the owner, the document owner, is listed, right, and that the correct person is doing the update. If this is an existing, if this isn't a brand new list, then we want to make sure that it's the same person who created it who's changing it. And so assuming all that works out, then we're going to grant access to the members of the list and to the owner of the list to that channel. And so now they're going to get not only this document, right, that describes the channel, but also the tasks that belong to the channel. So because those tasks are also being sent to that same channel. So you're kind of merging the tasks and these meta documents into these channels and granting access to the members so they can see that channel. So that's the core of the application functionality right there. This last branch is where we deal with making it so you can discover people to share lists with. So it's responsible for sending around all the usernames so that you can have a list of usernames to have a checkbox next to decide who is a member of your list. And I won't go into detail about what's happening there, but you can imagine, or at least I can imagine because I've been staring at these for a while, that you could build something arbitrarily complex and maybe a few hundred lines for really deep application, but between this and the ability to have potentially like a robot on your server that is subscribed to the to certain channels, like you may make a channel for documents that need to have a push notification sent via Urban Airship or something, and so if you if you're doing that, you can just have a robot subscribed to the push notifications channel off of the sync gateway, or you could just have a robot subscribed to the send an email for new users when they sign up channel, and so you can end up routing a lot of commands to your backend infrastructure via the sync gateway also, kind of using that architecture to power your application in general. So it's nice that you can start out with this really simple, drop in this one JavaScript function here, but the goal is to make it so that it's extensible to where as your application grows in complexity, it can support those more complex use cases. There's a lot of stuff that I'm not going to talk about today as far as, if this isn't flexible enough for you, there are ways to, programmatically manage the sync gateway, but or rather, kind of have an external process probe it and do things via the API to set up your access control how you want it. So you can do that, but the typical use case is going to be routing your data via the sync function. So I hope that was helpful for people who are new to this and wanting to figure out, where to get started. So thanks again, Lauren, for joining us, and we may have time to take a few questions here at the end. So here are some links. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, we have actually a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to be pretty fast so we can cover as many as possible. And the first question that we have is for Lauren. So in particular, they want to know, how does PhoneGap compare to the native platforms in terms of easiness, easy of use, and how does it compare to Trigger.io?
Direct comparison to Trigger.io or other frameworks that provide other hybrid frameworks. I'll leave that to lengthier replies and blog posts and whatnot. In terms of ease of use, one of our big goals is to trend towards ease of startup and as well as later depth. So that kind of mirrors what you saw out of Couchbase. Is we want it to be as easy as possible and as quick as possible to get up and running. And once you're up and running, we saw a really quick demo of the CLI. You are programming in web tech that you are probably familiar with. So we've got leveraging of your existing programmer skill set to get started writing native apps very, very quickly. Comparing that to the actual process of writing a purely native app, the learning curve is far, far, far shallower. It's much easier to get started with Cordova, even if you haven't programmed in web tech, than it is to get started in an iOS app in Objective-C. And one thing that a colleague has mentioned is the future-proof nature of PhoneGap. So while the device ecosystem has drastically changed since PhoneGap was first released, and despite those changes, PhoneGap is still around and is still offered and is stable on the dominant platforms. And again, these are all our APIs are based on open standards, so those maintain compatibility as devices come on the market, perhaps fade from the market. Cordova offers a platform across those gaps.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Now a question for Chris about the sync gateway. Can we configure that only certain devices can sync on a certain gateway? So sort of device management?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you can build that on top of our user infrastructure. So each sync gateway has, or even within a sync gateway, you can have multiple databases that have independent configuration. So each database has a set of users that can be managed via the admin API. And if you build, a set of users that corresponds to the devices for your application, then you can build that.
Thank you, Chris. And kind of a follow-up question for Lauren. We got a lot of comments about your application that you developed, that you show on the demo, which looked like a little bit of a sort of an Evernote in a simple way. So how much effort did it take to build that kind of application using PhoneGap?
Building an application like that using PhoneGap is incredibly easy. You can get something like that up and running very, very quickly. Partially too by leveraging external resources to PhoneGap, but things that are out and in the open. So one thing that my project uses is a CSS library called Topcoat. For the design challenge, such as myself, it's really easy to push into a project and apply some professional-looking styles to the project. It has there's a massive library both in Topcoat and in other libraries of open icons. So those icons that you saw in my app were using SVG, so they scale with the screen, and they're out available free and in the open as part of the Topcoat project. So whipping something, it's kind of like making a recipe. You've got the ingredients, styling from Topcoat, the core framework from PhoneGap, and then the web tech that can lay out the different views. The actual core of the application I was able to put together in a couple of hours.
Thank you, Lauren. Question for Chris. So right now, Couchbase Lite is in beta and available for Android, iOS, and plus we have the PhoneGap plugin. Will it be available for Windows as well? And what's the timeline for the GA?
So Windows support is not planned for GA. We have a lot of interest in that, and we see a path toward implementing it. So to me, I think Windows is really interesting. There's surprisingly a lot of interest in it compared to its market share. So we're looking at that. Right now, our timeline is to have a beta release before the end of the year, a beta 2, so that people can check out the latest enhancements. And especially on Android, we've made a bunch of progress, so people will be able to use that. Then the actual GA is planned for Q1, and I'm hoping it's early February. But we'll see. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question about, again, the sync gateway. So I think for Chris, how does it work in anonymous scenarios, public read only?
Sure. So the sync function is it controls write access to all documents. As far as if you had a function that was to throw an error for everything, then no one would be able to write. But generally, the sync function is more about specifying channels and then who can access the channels. So the anonymous user is just a guest user, and you can assign them whatever channels you'd like. So there's a user in the administrative API that you can set. Say maybe they should get the public channel or something.
Great. I think that's all we have for today. I want to thank you, Lauren and Chris, for an awesome presentation, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found it useful, and I want to remind everyone that you can watch all the webinars on Couchbase Lite are available on couchbase.com/webinars. Again, thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you at the next webinar.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.